Thank you very much for that flattering introduction. I can tell you I've still got my business. So I go in the mornings when the House isn't sitting, so I actually think it's quite important that members of Parliament should know what is going on outside the Westminster Bar. But thank you for inviting me and asking me to speak with Ruth Lee. Ruth has been a heroine of mine for many years. Whenever you're listening to the radio and there's somebody talking sense, when they say at the end, thank you very much, Ruth, it's always Ruth Lee. And so to be on a platform with her makes me feel I've really arrived as far as being a political speaker and guest is concerned. It's also a great pleasure to be here and see so many of my old friends from the City of London Westminster Conservative Association, which I was chairman of, and I see half the leading lights are here, so that's absolutely splendid, and thank you all for coming. I've got a rather dry topic to talk to you about, but one that I think is important, and that is European scrutiny and how it's done, or how it's not done, as the case may be, in this Parliament, and how much onto our statute book, or effectively onto our statute book, with amazingly little scrutiny that has the full force of a law that's been passed by Parliament in the normal way. In a way, following on from Ruth has given you the economic case for why we can afford a new relationship with Europe. And what I hope I'm going to try to do, at least in part, is give you more of the case on the democratic deficit, that there is a lack of control of what happens in Europe that should be worrying, troubling to anybody who believes in democracy. So what I thought I'd start with is simply what the European Scrutiny Committee does, what our job is. We don't check the rules coming from Europe. We simply check how our ministers respond to them and then report that to Parliament for debate. We get about 1,000 documents a year that come through that we have to look at and decide whether they should be debated or not. Of those, we've sent in the last year, I think, 55 for debate, and only four, have gone onto the floor of the House of Commons. When they go onto the floor of the House of Commons, they get an hour and a half. Most of which, I have to say, is taken up by Bill Cash, of whom I'm a great admirer. But he makes sure that his words are heard on these occasions. And he's a formidable scrutineer because he knows the detail of what is going on. But if you think about that, 1,000 bits of European regulation, of which 4 are debated on the floor of the House of Commons. Now, of those, and I've got here, this is 1 week. 1 week of stuff from Europe passed through the European Scrutiny Committee. This is volume 59 of this session of Parliament. So just imagine how high this pile is for the session so far. And there's still a few weeks to go. I think we'll get to 70 of these, near enough, by the end of the session. And I think you might like to know what's actually in here. What's coming through from Europe in 1 week, and how is it being approached? Well, we had a document that we sent for debate that was a white paper on pensions. European white paper is exactly the same, really, as a Whitehall white paper. It's a pretty advanced discussion document. And what does the government say? The government's view is that most aspects of pension policy remain a matter of national competence. So why have we got this lengthy report covering a white paper from the European Union on pensions when it's in fact a matter of national competence? And that's the first striking thing that I found on the European Scrutiny Committee. All those scare stories you've heard about the ratchet, they're true. Week in, week out, we're discussing things that Europe doesn't have competence for. So we sent that for debate. But then even better, I'm sure you'll like this one, EU criminal justice, legislation and detention to set minimum rights for how criminal justice is operated in this country. Again, a matter under which we have an opt-out under Title V of the Treaties on Functioning of the European Union, but again, something that Europe is constantly pushing and trying to inveigle us into. We have sent those for debate in committee. That gives you an idea of the importance of things that will be sent for debate on the floor of the House. For the floor of the House, we have to get the agreement of the government to allow us a 1.5 hour slot. We can suggest it, but we can't be guaranteed it. In a committee, we get about 3 hours to discuss it. And I brought with me a couple of examples of committees, because I thought you might like to know about them, because they were committees I served on, to further illustrate the whole approach of the EU to its garnering of powers. The first one was on the rights of the child, and the minister responding was Sarah Tever, who's actually very impressive. I may not expect me to say this about a Lib Dem, but she is very impressive and batted this one away reasonably well, considering the biases of Lib Dems. But she said that the EU proposes that those of its policies that directly or indirectly affect children should be designed and implemented to take account of the best interests of the child. Well, that's very highly controversial, isn't it? That we should take into account the best interests of the child. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is the point. That Europe gets into British law through the motherhood and apple pie route. That it comes up with things that are none of its business. It's got no standing in the treaties to take an interest in this. But it comes up with a document which, even for me, even for an ardent Eurosceptic, how do I stand up and say, come on, we're not interested in the rights of children? It's very difficult to do that. So they get in and under with something that is so hard to oppose that they then begin to build up authority in it. It's the motherhood and apple pie approach. And then they've got competence. And once they've got competence, of course, then they can regulate it, and what comes next? Well, you're doing things in the best interest of the child. There are cross-border implications, sometimes to family breakup. Wouldn't it be important to have a regulation to deal with that? Actually, wouldn't it be simpler and better if instead of national governments and national courts dealing with residency of children issues, in case there are cross-border implications, shouldn't it be unified at the European level? No, that's not on the agenda yet. But the rights of the child shouldn't, in fact, be on the agenda at all. It's nothing to do with the European Union. The other one I thought I'd bring along was one that was interesting because of the range of opposition it had. It was on the proposed regulation on offshore oil drilling. And it was opposed by a Lib Dem, a pro-European Labour member, the government, and me, of course, because I oppose EU things in principle. I think that is why people in North East aren't so voted for me, and it's certainly why you've come along to listen to me today. So it was opposed on a number of grounds, the most important of which was that this regulation is being introduced by qualified majority vote. Ruth mentioned the share of the vote that we've got. How much offshore oil and gas drilling do you think there is in Europe outside the UK and the non-member state Norway? Well, the figure we were given in the debate was 10%. Quite a lot of European countries don't actually have any coastline. And yet they're introducing a regulation on something that has absolutely nothing to do with them. And worse, energy policy was a matter that was in the Constitution, but was taken out for the Lisbon Treaty. So not only do they not have competence in this area, it was specifically excluded at the point at which the Lisbon Treaty was brought through. So how do you think they get in onto this one? Because this isn't motherhood and apple pie, this is complicated technical stuff. I mean, I would make no pretense of being an expert on offshore oil and gas drilling. I know a bit about European regulation, but not about how you pump oil out of the North Sea. They do it under the environmental approach and under our old favourite, health and safety. And so they use the powers that they've got for a completely separate purpose to come in round the back door and introduce a regulation that it only affects the UK. Well, isn't that sad? So we can make life a little bit difficult for the UK, unless probably we give them something in return. That would be my guess, that this will, our government is arguing for downgrading it from a regulation to a directive. My argument was we shouldn't have it at all, but that it's part of a negotiating ratchet to try and get governments to give things that you want by threatening them with regulations in other areas. And bear in mind that a regulation is law. It is just as effective law in the United Kingdom as an Act of Parliament. Indeed, in some ways, it's more effective law than an Act of Parliament, because an Act of Parliament can be struck down by the European Court of Justice, where regulation, I'm not aware of one having been recently. So you've got this whole effect of European power being built up with no proper democratic accountability. And to go back to this weekly chart, because you haven't heard the worst of it yet. You've just had what we sent for debate, and a couple of debates as an illustration. There were in here dozens of documents, well, not quite a dozen documents that were cleared, and the ones that we didn't clear, each one of which involved amending the law. Now, you all know how a law is changed in the UK, I think. Formal first reading, long second reading, committee stage, report stage, off to the House of Lords, same thing there, back to House of Commons, bit of ping pong if you want it, then it's agreed. Process that takes 9 months, something like that. An opportunity for constituents to write in. I lost count of how many letters I got on the NHS bill and say this is all madness, please stop it. Or for them to write in and say this is absolutely brilliant, go ahead with it, full steam ahead. With these European directives, there is no attention paid to it in that way at all. It is not a process that is subject to any proper scrutiny by anyone. So in 1 week, we had information about prescription medicines, which was amending a directive, qualified majority vote. We had the EU programme for social change and innovation, a draft regulation, qualified majority vote. We had their paper on economic governance, macroeconomic imbalances, commission document, they're free to do what they like. We had accession to the Hague Convention on Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction, a treaty change, signing up to a treaty requires unanimity. We had the General Data Protection Regulation, qualified majority vote. And as an aside on that, there is a directive on the storing of data relating to email traffic and so on and so forth, which could be amended by Europe to do exactly what the government was proposing a week ago, and that could be done by qualified majority vote without Parliament having a say at all. So we may be able to stop it here and not be able to stop it in Europe. And the final one I'm going to mention is data processing in the framework of police and criminal cooperation. Pretty important, that, but rights people have when being dealt with by the police. Again, qualified majority vote with no scrutiny coming other than our ability to send it for a debate. And I've discussed the debates, an hour and a half on the floor of the chamber, the floor of the House, or a 2.5-hour debate in a committee with about a dozen people discussing it, with me asking questions and the Minister defending, that sort of thing. Where, ladies and gentlemen, is the democracy in that? Where is the consulting with the British people? Where do they get any idea of what is going on in this concept of the European Union? How do we, as elected politicians, maintain the rights of the British people to have their freedoms protected? Where do they have the right, as they did in 1997 and again in 2010, where do they have the right to chuck out the government that they don't like, to get rid of the people who've introduced the laws that they're opposed to? None of that is in here at all. Now, the European Scrutiny Committee does its best. We plough through these documents, we see what they are. We occasionally get them into the newspapers. The only two I've got into the newspapers over the last year were through using peculiar words. One through using the word persiflage, and the other through using the word floxinoculilification. Now, I'll say that again if you want. And if you use peculiar words, you can get obscure European regulations reported. But it's not very exciting stuff, is it? The qualified majority for a draft directive on data protection isn't going to set the world on fire. It's not dangerous dogs. And therefore, we have this enormous and growing democratic deficit, and we see it getting worse as Europe is able now to change governments at will. Isn't it? Isn't that what it did in Greece and in Italy? If we don't like your government, say what we like about Mr. Berlusconi, but at least he had a mandate, and people do say that what they like about Mr. Berlusconi. And this seems to me to be a real and deep-seated problem that will not be answered by more Europe. There is not an answer to it through increasing the powers of the European Parliament. It is back with what Ruth was saying, a fundamental renegotiation of our relationship, the reinstitution of democratic controls, back to the promises that we had in 1972 that things would not come in except on a unanimous basis, that we could always veto any regulation that came from Europe. So that is the brief history of European scrutiny. Thank you very much.